I'm very excited that you're here today for Tobey. Tobey is coming for multiple purposes. I began working with him a couple years ago as part of a project that we have trying to tag some sharks on the south shore of Long Island. Through that interaction, it dawned on me that Tobey fits a great role that, as part of the SoMAS strategic plan, was put out by the faculty, that we should build linkages with federal agencies outside ourselves, and Tobey fits that role very well. And so Tobey's giving a presentation to you about the stuff that he does, but he's also has put in to be an adjunct associate professor here, which would help build linkages even more with students and projects. Tobey went to Southampton College, so there's a link there on the island. He then went on and got a master's degree at the University of Florida in the fisheries department there. Went on to get his PhD at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. Am I saying that right? Tobey works as a fisheries specialist in the highly migratory division of NOAA, and even recently he was the acting coordinator for the animal tracking network, or
Telemetry network.
Telemetry network. So I'm very excited that Tobey's coming here in many ways and presenting with you his work that he's done. So please welcome our speaker, Tobey Curtis.
All right, let me grab this thing here. Thank you very much, Brad. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, and everyone else, faculty, staff. This is my first time really on main campus here, so it's been great, great experience so far. So as Brad indicated, today I'm going to talk about, and let me know if the audio is weird or if I'm too loud or too quiet. Just raise your hand in the back if you can't hear me. So I'm going to talk a bit about my background, which is a bit of a mashup of shark tracking and fisheries management, and trying to merge the two in a more systematic way. Brad covered this, thankfully, but I'll go through quickly. I do have some sort of roots here on Long Island. I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I went to college at Southampton. My wife is from Port Jeff, so I spent a lot of time down here, and it's been really, really fantastic and rewarding to be doing research here now over the last several years, working mainly in collaboration with the folks at the Southport Natural History Museum, some of who are here. Greg and Frank and everybody, thank you for your support. You'll see a lot of familiar slides maybe in here from our work. So I did my master's doing acoustic tracking on bull sharks in Florida, and my PhD on satellite tracking of basking sharks. So I've got a pretty broad experience with different types of telemetry and shark tracking. Obviously, a juvenile bull shark is a much different range and behavioral pattern than a basking shark. But I've worked for NOAA Fisheries, based in Gloucester, Massachusetts, for 18 years. And in that time, I've worked on every elasmobranch fishery we have in the Atlantic. I think I'm the only person that's ever done that. So I started out working on skates and spiny dogfish, which are actually the two largest elasmobranch fisheries we have in the Atlantic. And for about the last 8 years, I've been working for the highly migratory species management division, which works on the larger legit sharks, your typical coastal sharks, and pelagic sharks. And that covers their whole range. Our management covers Maine to Texas in the U.S. Caribbean. So we cover a lot of territory and a lot of species. As Brad mentioned, I did a detail last year as the Animal Telemetry Network Coordinator, which is a national program that coordinates and delivers telemetry data products to managers and provides services to telemetry users nationwide. So that was a great experience and exposed me to even more new telemetry tools and applications. So overview of my talk, I'm kind of going to cover some telemetry 101 for folks that may not be super familiar with the technology. Talk a little bit about vertical movements, horizontal movements, vertical movements, species distribution models, and then a little bit of a look into the not too distant future with this exciting technology. So where do we begin? I apologize occasionally to illustrate a point. I have to use a non-shark image, but I try to stick to at least shark food. So obviously this is important, can be shark food, but I just think it's a fantastic picture of a seal looking goofy with some high-tech bling attached to it. So really, why do we tag stuff? There's a lot tagging gets a lot of attention. You know, every Shark Week episode is somebody tagging something. There's movies about it. It's kind of a high profile thing, but you know, what are some of the reasons we actually tag stuff with, scientifically? What are the real applications and needs for tagging stuff? And I found this great quote recently, and I thought it was a great observation. To me, if life boils down to one thing, it's movement. To live is to keep moving. So telemetry is really about movement, studying movement. I don't know if anyone recognizes that quote. I thought maybe it was could have been like a David Attenborough or Eugene Clark kind of wise observation, but it was actually another fantastic observer of the natural world. Here, Jerry is all about movement. So great quote there. So shark tracking technology has advanced quite a bit in recent decades, thankfully. This is kind of a joke, but it's also not too far from the truth. I actually double checked the dates earlier. If you didn't know, actually one of the very first shark tracking studies ever done, it was done on juvenile sandbar sharks, where the scientists attached fishing bobbers to the sharks, and they followed them around like this in the boat. They followed the bobber on the surface, and so it's that's rudimentary shark tracking right there. You can get the job done. So I don't know if Hooper ever collected any data on the positions of the shark, but that's how it all began. You know, just tracking things from the surface. This is an infographic from the Animal Telemetry Network, which kind of highlights the three main types of telemetry tags I'll be talking about. This is how we track marine. We have acoustic tags here on the left. So acoustic tags use sound. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we have kind of two categories of satellite tags, which I'll be mainly focusing on. We have satellite transmitters, which communicate with the satellite when the animal's at the surface. And then we have pop-up archival tags of different varieties that archive depth and temperature and light level observations for a period of time on the animal, and then they pop up after 6 months, a year, and they transmit all the data at once. And then you kind of reconstruct the shark's movements after that time. But the cool thing is that all of these tag types can answer all of these very important resource management questions or challenges. So fisheries, ocean observation, climate adaptation, species conservation. So this is like sort of the NOAA, this kind of covers the NOAA mission, right? We're kind of studying these types of things. They're obviously great ecological and life history tools, but for applied applications, telemetry is very powerful. And there's trade-offs that I'll get into on each of the different technology types, but you can cover a lot of ground and answer a lot of, very priority management questions with this technology. So we'll start with acoustic tags. I know some of the folks in the room are very overly familiar with acoustic telemetry. Again, it uses sound. Radio waves do not transmit through seawater, so use ultrasonic frequencies. 69 kilohertz is kind of the standard for the passive acoustic telemetry systems that we have up and down the coast of North America. And so these small transmitters, they emit a pulse every, and you can they transmit like pulse code. And so these receivers that are moored in different places up and down the coast, they record when they hear a certain tag and they decode it and they identify the actual animal that it went to. So this little dusky shark here had this tag implanted, and it's going to ping away for 5 to 10 years. I forget exactly which tag went into this fish. But for a number of years, you can track that fish, and anytime it passes one of these little easy passes in the ocean, the easy pass will log when that shark was there. So in the satellite categories, again, shark food, shark sea turtle predator. These are the real sort of real-time satellite transmitters. These are the ones that are fin mounted on sharks or put on the head of a seal or the shell of a sea turtle. They work great for air breathers, mouth breathers, I call them. If it comes to the surface and it transmits, then you can get near real-time satellite locations, position fixes of those animals when they're at the surface. And you can, and so for critters that do that, they spend enough time at the surface, this is a great tool to monitor their movements. And then we have the pop-up satellite archival tags. Sorry, I don't know how this guy got in here. I'll move the cursor off his face though. So this is a sandbar shark. This is a critter that actually doesn't spend a lot of time on the surface, very little. So if we put a spot tag satellite transmitter on its fin, we'd probably never hear from it. So using acoustic tags or archival tags are really the best tool for that kind of an animal because they don't surface enough to get satellite position fixes. When we're talking about satellite tags specifically, we're really talking about the Argos satellite system. This is, I think, originally launched in 1978. Over 150,000 animals have been tracked by Argos satellites since that time. And this is just a 10-year kind of sample of animal tracks. We got birds and terrestrial animals, fish, and mammals and turtles. And Argos has global coverage, and it's been a fantastic resource for studying large-scale global animal movements. So Argos, when we talk about satellite tagging, we're for the most part specifically talking about Argos, and that's supported by NOAA, NASA, and the French Space Agency. So it's an international collaborative satellite system that supports the tracking of animal movements and the movements of other platforms. Satellite and acoustic telemetry have been growing at a rapid pace. The use of the technology has rapidly expanded, especially in the last 20 years. I was just thinking about this when I started at Southampton College, and I started getting into the literature about shark tracking and shark movements. I think, so I won't totally pinpoint it, but somewhere around there, I had read every single paper that had ever been published on tracking sharks. Acoustic, satellite was barely available at that point. So it's phenomenal to see the growth and the accessibility of the technology in the last 20 years in particular. And this is a taxonomic breakdown. You can see that satellite is used more for the turtles and mammals. And there's a bit of a mix for the elasmobranchs, and for fish, there's definitely a bias or leaning towards acoustic, and that's really a size limitation of the transmitters. Most bony fish are too small for most of the satellite tag package sizes. I'm sorry. But the point here is that the use of this technology is growing rapidly. And this is an example of the kind of data you can get. This is a study that published last year, Cameron Braun et al. At WHOI, and there's multiple species, and satellite, Argos satellite telemetry can literally track animals across ocean basins. It's really phenomenal. So if you have large scale migratory or ocean scale habitat use type questions for species that travel huge distances, this is the best, most powerful tool you can get. And so we're typically, as the technology has become more used, we see a lot of studies that talk about seasonal distribution, habitat selection, sort of migratory pathways, and then stock identification, connectivity, some population structure. Our fish, bluefin tuna, for example, like before we had a lot of large scale tagging. Do we know that the bluefin in the Gulf of Mexico and the bluefin in the Mediterranean were the same population of fish? Now because of tagging and telemetry, we understand those dynamics a lot better and how they migrate, how they mix. So a more local example of satellite telemetry is with project that I worked on with the SoFo folks, Harbor Branch, OSearch, and some other collaborators, where we tracked about 20 young of the year white sharks here at Long Island. And this is just sort of a little ping pong plot of where those sharks swam. These are just satellite transmissions of sharks during those months, during the summer months after they were tagged. And so it's a great kind of local example of how the technology can be used. Obviously, white sharks, they have to be at the surface enough to get these positions. So this is just demonstrating where those position fixes work. So you can see they're really moving up and down the south shore of Long Island, making occasional visits a little further off the shelf. And then where they go in the winter, I have another slide for that, but this is just an example of like first cut. We had no clue what the movement or home range of these animals were until we started tagging them. And now we have very clear kind of boundaries on where they like to hang out, what their movement patterns are in their nursery area. So you put all that stuff together on the map. And then once you have that, you can start extracting environmental covariance. You can match environmental factors to those movements, and you start getting some habitat use or habitat selection parameters. So, bottom depth, water temperature, chlorophyll, salinity, things like that. And this is like, usually, again, the first cut. This is like, we have no information on movements of an animal or a population. You get some tags out, and you start getting these basic ecological observations. So that's great. This is really powerful, and this is where we've come a long way in getting more tags out of more species and more places and understanding some of these basic movement patterns. But getting back to the ATN slide where we have all these needs, we have these priority conservation and management needs, especially as a NOAA manager. There's certain information that we need to have to better manage our fish populations. And so I've been trying to move, looking for examples of moving satellite telemetry in particular beyond just those observational data sets and really trying to apply them more specifically to priority management needs like spatial management assessment, MPAs, closed areas, things like that. And then even more explicitly supporting the stock assessment process. In the US, NOAA, we heavily rely on stock assessments for fisheries management. And telemetry can actually generate some very key metrics that get plugged into stock assessment models and improve our understanding of population dynamics of these species. So fisheries exposure, bycatch risk, actually supporting or getting at fishing mortality rates and things like catchability or Q. So I'll talk about some kind of illustrative examples of how we can derive some of those key metrics from satellite telemetry. Offshore wind is a big deal. I know this slide is a little bit dated now. Some of these offshore wind areas have kind of changed, but this is our white shark satellite tracking data relative to offshore wind sighting. And you can see there is some overlap in certain places. This is during summer months. And so this is just one very basic overlay. It's like, all right, we have a habitat impact, a stressor coming in, this construction going on, or the plans, what's going to be the impact on the white sharks? Well, looks like they spend most of their time inside of where the offshore wind sites will be, but there is some overlap. There's likely to be some effect on those sharks from those activities. This gives you a very different picture from what you get from all the acoustic telemetry going on, which is a great tool for really getting fine scale positioning or residency of individuals within these sites. But the satellite telemetry kind of gives you the broader context of where are these sharks going when they're not in a wind site or near an acoustic receiver. And so you get a kind of a broader, more natural understanding of the breadth of the individual's movements and not be strained by where there's acoustic receiver coverage. So where did these sharks go for the winter? It turned out to be another important management application. The sharks overwinter off the Carolinas. When they leave October, November, they head down to the Outer Banks for the most part, and that's where they spend their winter months. Well, it turns out that the essential fish habitat designation for young of the year white sharks currently is only up here from the New York Bight up to southern New England. And so there's a clear mismatch here between where the sharks are overwintering and where we have sort of special habitat designations for the life stage for young of the year white sharks specifically. So just another showing where the sharks go is one thing, but then we have a clear management application in this case. Going from one of the sexiest species in the ocean to one of the least sexy, we have here a thorny skate. I don't know how many folks are aware of thorny skates or familiar with them, but they're actually the most overfished stock in the Northeast. Their biomass is down over 95% from historical levels. They're mainly distributed in the Gulf of Maine. They've shown really very little signs of any kind of recovery, even though they've been prohibited from being landed for over 20 years. And so there's multiple factors at play there, but basically there was no information. This is a heavily discarded fish. There's no, it's not landed, it's been protected, so it's all discarded, but there's no information on the distribution or range of these species. And thankfully satellite tags have now gotten small enough that we can actually start putting satellite tags on smaller animals like skates. I think our smallest skate was around 50 centimeters, half a meter in length. And so we could deploy pop-up tags on those fish and start to get a better idea of what their movements are and the distribution patterns. Jeff Meebone, who led the study that I collaborated on, he likes to call this the most boring satellite tagging study in the world because the fish didn't move very far. I think the maximum displacement distance was about 50 kilometers, maybe less. But that in itself is a very important result because we can now match if there's a need for spatial management, closed areas, time area closures, things like that. We know that a relatively small area can actually have a big impact on protecting thorny skates from bycatch. So in this case, this is the Cassius Ledge closed area in the Gulf of Maine. And 90% of the skates tagged inside the closed area stayed in the closed area. So not a lot of movement, not super exciting to put on a map, but a very important practical fisheries management result. And I'll circle back to a little bit more on the thorny skates later too. So in terms of fisheries exposure, second. There's been some recent work. I'll show an example of, because we've had a growing number of studies of satellite tagging different types of sharks, we can now kind of map their movements and ranges and how much that overlaps with fishing activity. And so there tends to be a fair amount of overlap, and I'll show an example. But fisheries fish for fish, right? So we shouldn't actually be surprised that there's overlap between fisheries and fish distributions. And we have a lot of fishery dependent data we rely on routinely, logbooks, landing reports, things to help us quantify those catch and bycatch amounts. We have observer programs that actually are off the boats that can kind of count what's being caught and discarded. But for sharks, most catches are kind of incidental to targeting other species. You know, things like tuna and swordfish tend to be targets. Here off Long Island, recreational fisheries targeting fluke, striped bass, or bluefish, still catching a lot of sharks. So it's usually, there's not a whole lot of targeted shark fishing anymore. There's some, but it's much lower than it used to be. So telemetry is a great way to sort of complement fishery dependent data, traditional data sources, and fill gaps where we don't have a lot of information about overlap of especially rare species that are rarely caught. We can help get some data on their potential exposure to fishing activity. So here's one of the examples I referenced. This is a study by Quiros et al. 2019. By et al, if anyone's familiar with this paper, there was like 1,000 authors. So here's short fin mako satellite tracks across the North Atlantic, and they overlaid that with fishing effort metrics for ICAP, pelagic longline fisheries. And so they developed these heat maps of overlap between fish and fishery. And they found that there's about 62% overlap on average for short fin makos in fishery. But again, not necessarily surprising. We know we have a lot of the traditional data that mako sharks are caught as bycatch in those fisheries. Until recently, they were pretty regularly landed because makos are tasty. You know, relying on a fishery independent method, the telemetry, to help validate the interaction rates and bycatch rates in the fishery data is really insightful. But to take that a step further, Michael Byrne et al. In this study, again, short fin mako sharks, these are more tracks in the Western Atlantic, but they actually identified fishing capture events in their satellite tag data. So these red triangles are locations where mako sharks were actually captured. And then you can see that after that capture event, the track basically went to one of the nearest ports. And so they tracked these fish to the port where they were actually landed. Some were caught in recreational fisheries here in the Mid-Atlantic, and some were caught in commercial pelagic longline fisheries further north and east. But basically, 30% of their tagged mako sharks were caught. So that approximates a fishing mortality rate of 0.3, which actually aligned with the fishing mortality rate estimated from the more traditional stock assessment approaches. But it was a good gut check. Previous assessments had kind of underestimated the fishing mortality rate, and this helped inform that, okay, well, the fishing mortality rate is actually considerably higher than we thought in the past. Getting back to our white sharks locally, I did a kind of similar analysis as another example. So here we have our juvenile white shark tracks and bottom fishing effort during the summer months. And not only there's about 36% overlap between our white sharks and bottom fishing efforts. This is trawl and gill net effort. This is during the same time period. So it's summertime during the 2 years that these sharks were tracked, 2016, 2017. So it's a pretty apples to apples comparison. But that brings us to the third dimension, which of course, the third dimension is terror. So the ocean is a three-dimensional environment, and so we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about some of these spatial management or fishery overlap metrics. This is an example of our PSAT data from one of the juvenile white sharks, and you can see that these sharks are, this is a time series, so they're bouncing down in the water column, 0 to 40 meters. You can see they spend most of their time less than 15 meters above the thermocline, with occasional bounces into deeper, cooler water. And we get temperature data too, which is great, because we can get temperature preference, type data from the pop-up tag as well as just the sort of vertical distribution for movements. So again, why do we study vertical movements? You can make a lot of inferences from the vertical data about foraging behavior. If they're at the surface, maybe they're eating, pelagic schooling prey. If they're closer, spend more time near the bottom, they're probably foraging on more demersal prey. Just basic ecological information that you can't get from horizontal positioning alone. But that also has important implications for monitoring. Are they visible to surface-oriented visual observation, like drones or area surveys? And the same goes for fisheries. If fisheries are, especially here, like off New York, they're mainly demersal fisheries, bottom trawl, bottom gill net. And so how much time vertically are the sharks exposed to the fishery? So Rachel Shaw worked on this for her master's thesis at Harvard Branch. And so instead of just looking at the shark's position in the water column relative to the surface, we actually she quantified the amount of time they're spending near the bottom. And so here we have the bottom depth. You see different sharks did different things. Some were more surface oriented and others were kind of using whole water column. Or certain times they'd be spending much more time closely associated with the bottom. And so we could actually produce three-dimensional tracks. So this is what you can do when you combine multiple tag technologies. This is a combination of the satellite transmitter on the dorsal fin and the PSAT recording the vertical movements. And so you can actually reconstruct three-dimensional movements in their habitat, which to me is fascinating and just gives you some new, really great new insights into really how these animals are using the environment, or horizontally and vertically. So when you consider those things in the context of availability to fishing gear, bycatch exposure, or getting to the catchability coefficient Q, again, which is used in stock assessments, we have our 36% overlap horizontally, but we found that there's only 16% overlap vertically with bottom gear. And then you make some inferences about the efficiency of the gear. In this case, 75% efficiency of a shark being caught if it encounters a trawl. You factor those things together, and this approximates catchability Q, and you find that the actual susceptibility to capture is an order of magnitude lower than what you'd expect from a horizontal overlap alone. So this is kind of an illustrative example of the importance of the vertical component when you're talking about fishery bycatch exposure and catchability. And then getting back to the fisheries management side of it, you can use all of these elements to tailor fishery management regulations if you need to better conserve these fish. So everyone tends to gravitate towards MPAs and closed areas, which are great in some cases that work really well. But you can also think about seasons or time area closures because there's a time component here. But if you're talking about vertical availability, you can address time of day restrictions if there's deal patterns in the vertical distribution, or fishing depth limits. If there's certain depths that the sharks are most likely to occur. And then as far as efficiency, this is where a lot of time has been spent in a lot of fisheries research gear technology, gear modifications, soak time limits, best practices, things that enhance the survival of sharks that are caught. So you can either try to reduce the bycatch of sharks by reducing the gear's efficiency, or you can do certain things to just minimize the mortality of the animals that do encounter the gear. And so the point is just that when you have a complete picture of where these sharks are hanging out, you don't have to rely on you don't have to just fall back on this closed area thing, which is very costly when you're talking about fisheries management. Fishermen don't like losing bottom for any reason. And so this is a tough pill to swallow if you're falling back on closed areas all the time. So as far as vertical movements, we've advanced quite a bit, again, in the last 10 to 20 years. This is a paper that we contributed data to that published a couple of years ago, a global synthesis. I think there was maybe about 40 species in this sort of analysis. They kind of just summarized the vertical distributions of about 40 species of sharks. Almost 1,000 satellite tags went into this kind of meta-analysis. And it just helped show the differences in vertical distributions of all these different species. But then again, in the context of monitoring, like aerial drones or things like that, diver observing, and fisheries. So, you know, the availability of these different species varies depending on their vertical movements. So that being said, this is a cool analysis, great progress, but we know there's over 1,100 species of elasmobranchs, many with very severe conservation needs. And most of these are sharks. There's been very little done on batoids. So we have a lot of work to do. To get into more of these questions, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of species, a lot of places that need to be studied to better fill in these gaps. Okay, so moving on, another important aspect of vertical movements, and one of the focal points of our work with Southport Natural History Museum is looking at post-release behavior. So lots of fish that get released alive, it doesn't mean they ultimately survive the capture process. So even if you have a catch and release fishery, you know that there's some mortality, post-release mortality. So biologging of the activity patterns using PSATs, it can identify mortality events. And this is whatever our kind of life alert kind of thing, but the data you get is literally flatline when you get mortality. So here's an example, going back to our thorny skate work. We tagged, I think, 75 thorny skates in the Gulf of Maine. So again, not much to look at, but this is actually the most satellite tagged elasmobranch off the east coast of the US, as far as I know. White sharks and other things get a lot of press. We've actually tagged like 180 or something of these with satellite tags. So it's exciting to get into that data set. But here's an example of a thorny skate that died. It was released, bounced around for several days, and then stopped moving vertically. And this is the flat line. It's mortality. It did not survive the trawl, and this is done in trawls. So it did not survive the trawl capture. And with enough tags deployed, we are actually to develop a range of 17 to 25% post-release mortality for skates, depending on their size. The bigger they were, the better they fared. So they had a little bit lower survival than the smaller skates, which had a 25% mortality. Given the volume that these skates are discarded at, I'm talking like thousands of tons of discards in trawl fisheries, this number has a huge effect on our understanding of their population status. And so it's a very important metric to have. If you assume 100% mortality, like we're completely decimating that population, even at 50%, it's a big impact. But here it's like, okay, well, there is some resilience to survival. There's other things we have to do to try to reduce bycatch. But when bycatch does happen, at least we're looking at, roughly 75% survival of the skates that get tossed over the side. So it makes a tremendous difference in our understanding of the stock, our perception of stock status, and in the stock assessment process. Another great example is with blacktip sharks. Blacktip sharks are probably one of the most captured sharks in recreational shark fisheries up and down the coast. This is work by the New England Aquarium, Nick Whitney and Ryan Noddick. So just as another illustrative example, 2018 recreational estimates from NOAA estimate there are over 450,000 blacktip sharks caught along the Atlantic coast, and about 96% of those are released alive. Most of that fishery is catch and release. So obviously the post-release mortality rate is going to have a huge influence on our understanding of the true fishing mortality rate. Are we killing 458,000 sharks, or is it some percent less than that? So they used biologging tags, which are, these are acceleration data loggers, but they're basically a type of satellite archival tag. They stay on the shark for a few days, archiving vertical movements, and they pop up and are recovered. So they don't actually transmit except for their location, but they tagged 31 sharks with these, and they had 3 mortalities. So 9.7% post-release mortality rate. And here's some examples of vertical behavior. This is a shark that survived, just bouncing along in its merry way. No apparent problems after release. This shark died a little over an hour after release. This one a few minutes after release. And so you can see when you get mortalities, at least with these black tips, they tended to happen pretty quickly. Within a couple hours after the release, the shark either made it or didn't. But when you apply that rate to all those releases, you actually get a mortality of about 43,000 blacktip sharks that were released but ended up dying after the fact. And so when the stock system has that number to work with, that's a much more accurate estimate of the take by the recreational fishery that they can use to estimate catches and model in their assessment process. So post-release mortality can be a major source of mortality in fish populations, even in catch and release fisheries. And telemetry is probably the best way to get empirical data on post-release mortality rates. And it can be applied to the catch data and estimate the total fishing mortality rate. And then if you have enough sample size, like we do with the thorny skates, you can actually start look at covariance and get inferences on what factors contribute to mortality. Is it the size of the animal? Is it soak time? Is it water temperature? So the more data you have, the more you can help understand the factors that contribute to that mortality and work to reduce that mortality. So those are some of the, from my perspective, some of the key advancements we've made, trying to push satellite tracking into more applied fishery management needs and contexts. So now I'll shift over to distribution models. I know Jan and others might be a little more interested in this section. SDMs, or habitat suitability models, they have growing application in elasmobranch fisheries management. And we now have a number of methods to use satellite telemetry data to develop SDMs. Traditionally, most of them have been kind of survey-based, fishery independent survey data or fishery catch data. But there's methods now where you can use telemetry data to create species distribution models. And there's a number of NOAA tools, that we're now using these species distribution models to inform management. This is an example that we published last year, I think, where we used a mix of satellite tags and pop-up tags to develop models for blue shark. And we also compared that to observer data and some tag and release data. So we had multiple data types, and we created models for each data type and then compared those models across each other. But the point was that we have, for both types of satellite tags, you can develop these species distribution models. Here's some of the applied examples. NOAA products, we have EcoCast, which is a West Coast product. This is basically predicts where you're likely to have high bycatch. And then this is a mix of, here we have blue sharks, sea lions, leatherback turtles, and swordfish. So those are bycatch species that fisheries out there want to avoid. And this basically gives a short-term forecast based on distribution modeling of those species. So it's red area, avoid it. You're likely to get high bycatch in that area, so try not to fish there. And so this is a publicly available product where fishermen, they can go and get like a bycatch forecast, basically. Really excellent tool. Kind of inspired by this, with Atlantic HMS, we developed a PRISM model. This right now currently uses observer data, but we can also start implementing or tuning our models using satellite or acoustic telemetry data. In this example, I believe, is scalloped hammerhead shark. And so it's basically a heat map of scalloped hammerhead shark distribution. We are using PRISM to assess how reliant scalloped hammerheads are on this closed area. So this right here is off North Carolina, is the mid-Atlantic bottom long line closed area. And so we could actually use the model to generate, estimate how much time or how much reliability there is for that species in that closed area over certain time steps. We can look at recent years, we can go back in time. We can do it, I think we did monthly increments. So we made maps for each month of the year. We could estimate how much time the sharks are spending in there. And then similar vein, climate projections. This is a very awful map for thorny skate. This is showing basically the habitat loss of thorny skates in the Gulf of Maine due to climate change. So this is a projection out to end of the century, 2100. And the darker the red, the more thermal habitat loss there is for thorny skates in the Gulf of Maine. So it turns out that it's not just discards that are driving thorny skate population declines. It's actually a big part of the story is distribution shift. They're actually being forced out of the Gulf of Maine due to climate change. So climate change, obviously a big factor, something a lot of us are working on. An important topic for NOAA priorities. And so obviously I think everyone here knows in the Northwest Atlantic, we're dealing with much worse climate change outlook than most of the rest of the globe. And so our horizontal and vertical telemetry data can be used to generate SDMs and estimate the climate effects on tracked species. This is another example distribution model for shortfin mako. And this is the habitat, basically thermal habitat suitability loss or gain. by the end of the century. So this is the difference, basically the difference between the historical data set from 1993 to 2019 and end of century. The more blue areas are habitat loss, and the red areas are habitat gain. You can see there's not much red on this map. So short-fin makos are looking at a considerable loss of suitable habitat in the open ocean. The furthest, basically the further southern portions of their current range. And this is again models generated from at least partially from satellite telemetry. And jumping back again for another example with our white sharks, we kind of took a similar approach. This is these are satellite tag locations. We created a basic habitat suitability model using surface and bottom temperature and bathymetry. And we'll move the tracking positions. So, and then once you have this model, one of the benefits of having species distribution models, you can move them forward and back in time, as long as you have the available, environmental covariate data to overlay. So this is our sort of current time period. This is 20 years of average habitat suitability based on temperature and bathymetry for the white sharks. And just to simplify the visualization, I'm sticking with the top 25th and 50th percentiles of suitable habitat, just to make it easier to visualize. So again, this is our present, but we can go back in time now. We can go back to 1965 with this model and with these variables. And you can see that there's really no habitat here, very little off New England, and much more in the New York Bight, Mid-Atlantic Bight, coastal waters. Moving back to the present, you can see that there's already been a shift in suitable habitat towards the Northeast. Going to the end of the century, it's even more stark. So the white shark is losing suitable habitat to the south, gaining suitable habitat to the Northeast. I'll go back through that again. So past, present, future. And so we're using our satellite tagging data to estimate the climate velocity of white shark nursery habitat, about 20.4 kilometers per decade, which might not sound like a lot, but if you're a juvenile white shark and you're reliant on these sort of historical nursery habitats, what are the ramifications of being forced further north? If you are familiar with white sharks, you know that there's a number of seals that like to hang out of Cape Cod. So if our young of the year white sharks are being forced closer to the big mama and papa white sharks, they're likely to be potentially be cannibalized in the future if they're kind of forced in closer contact with the adults. Right now, there's a really nice size segregation. The pups are pretty protected close offshore off Long Island. But if they're forced further northeast, they're going to be bumping into the big grown-ups more frequently. Again, the vertical data, we can use the depth and temperature data to do something similar. You can see the shark's kind of cruising along, happy in its sort of preferred temperature range. And then it hits some hot water, hot surface water, and it started to spend some more time at depth to cool off. And so you can use these relationships, looking just at the vertical data, to find critical thermal thresholds for species. You get enough of these tracks, you can identify temperatures that they avoid, and you can use that to inform climate change as well. So the future. Future is bright, I think, for telemetry. I think the last 20 years, it's already been, we're kind of in a golden era of satellite tracking, at least for sharks. But so satellite tags are constantly getting smaller, longer lasting, more reliable. They have more sensors, they're less expensive. All this makes the technology more accessible and having broader applications, especially the size factor, where you can start to tag smaller and smaller fish. And so the technological advances will continue, as will the analytical tools. So again, shark food, that's like a Dorito-sized sea turtle. The tags are so small that you can actually tag these like little hatchling sea turtles. So conclusions. Satellite telemetry is an incredibly versatile tool for studying marine life. It can have a very real significant impact on fisheries management and conservation. And that was sort of the crux of my talk. I didn't just want to talk about the cool things we get to see with tracking animals over big distances, but really trying to push the field more towards applied applications and moving results that can really support very high priority conservation needs. So the technology, again, is going to be always advancing, and the future is bright for the technology. And you know, so I'm kind of like an evangelist for telemetry. I think that the tool is it can answer so many questions. Ecology, fisheries conservation, ocean observation, all those things. It's just a really fantastic and fun tool. Obviously, just going out and getting tagged sharks is fantastic, but the data you can get has even one tag on one shark, you can answer so many different questions and address important management needs. So I also developed some recommendations. I kind of developed these in the context of telemetry, but I think they really broadly apply to anyone who's doing sort of marine conservation oriented research. And so I really want to highlight the potential for cooperative research. A lot of the work I do is in cooperation with professional fishermen. The Thorny skate study, we tagged all those skates. We worked with a commercial dragger out of Gloucester to tag most of those skates. Doing that on our own by hook and line or working with a university vessel would have taken years. We tagged like 200 skates in like 4 trips or something like that. And similarly with the white shark work, we work with professional recreational fishermen here on Long Island, and having that expertise really helps get the job done. So collaboration with fishermen also fosters trust in the scientific process, and it can improve the acceptance of management outcomes. Sometimes we might find an answer that fishermen won't want to have, but if they've been part of the process and they've seen the data, they generally have a lot more buy-in. So there's a lot of really mutually beneficial aspects to cooperative research with fishermen. So I really highly encourage, if you have an opportunity to do that, give it a shot. Data accessibility. There's obviously growing demand for open science, but accessibility increases the potential uptake by managers. And putting on my manager hat, if I know I can go get a data set or reach out to somebody and get data that answers a very specific management priority need that I have, if it's out there in the public domain, it's easy for me to grab. It's going to really increase the uptake and the impact of the data. So use data repositories like ATN, or at least notify managers of your data sets, or at least papers when you publish papers that if you think it may have management relevance. And that leads into communication. Reach out to your friendly neighborhood fishery manager. Small tweaks, project design, and data products can result in bigger impact. I do a lot of this, and I'll go out on a limb and offer my services if anyone is interested. If they think they're doing work on something that may have interest to fisheries management, but you're not quite sure how to get your information out there, or how to tailor your results or data products to improve management, I'm happy to talk to folks and maybe help point them in the right direction or talk to the relevant managers. There's really not that many of us. If you're working on skates, there's like one person to talk to. If you're working on sharks, there's like 2 or 3 people to talk to in NOAA actually doing that work. If you're working on black sea bass or lobster, it's really a small number of people in the room that really make those management decisions. And so all it really is reaching out and having a conversation, and it can have a big impact on the ability of your data to have an impact on the management and conservation process. So that's it. That's all I have. I think we're okay in time, but happy to take any questions. Yes.
What do you know about wind energy, electrical leakage, and
nobody knows much of anything about that topic. There's very little known about it. BOEM insists that there's no impact. They're burying the cables. They're covered. They're shielded. There's been a little bit of acoustic telemetry work with skates and lobsters and a few other things, but it's really an open scientific question. If there is exposure of cables, and could be an increase in local electromagnetic fields, there really is not much information to know how sharks or skates or things will react. They're obviously sensitive. They can detect those electric fields, but the behavioral response has really been understudied. It's a big open question.
So we should build thousands of them.
Well, that's what we're doing. We're going to build lots of turbines, and then we'll kind of figure it out along the way. So that's what's happening. I mean, I'm supportive of renewable energy, it's showing the impacts of climate change on marine resources, it's a very real challenge, but I think there's also, we've gotta have, some more work and we're making a lot of progress very rapidly, I think, in studying the impacts of offshore wind. But that's one of the big open questions in my opinion, is studying the potential effects of electromagnetic fields, particularly on sharks, and skates and rays. Telemetry, tag some more stuff and figure it out. Yes.
So I'm sorry for going over this, the bus is not on my side today,
No.
but, what made you want to get into just doing more research like this and getting out there and actually tagging, say, with the sharks and stuff, like what really drove you to do that?
Sure. Yeah, I think like a lot of folks, I kind of had a lifelong fascination with sharks. I knew early on I love sharks, and I was kind of headed in that direction. I was very lucky as an undergrad. I had an excellent internship with Peter Klimley at Bodega Marine Lab in California, and he introduced me to acoustic telemetry and trained me up on that. And once I started to get a taste for that, where you're out in the field, you're seeing animals up close, you're attaching tags to them. But then, so that's just that exciting part is continues to draw me. Tagging sharks is a blast. But then when you see the data, when you get data back that no one's ever seen before, like, all right, you can't see these sharks except in that little window where they're on the surface or you catch them. Most of the time you can't see them, so where are they? And when you start to put those movements on a map, it's really just fascinating and exciting. So every time I get new tag data and I plot it, it's rewarding every time. So I never get tired of that. And so then it's just to facilitate that rush, you got to come up with questions to answer and get funding to do it, right? So that's a little bit of a cheeky response, I guess, but it's really about coming up with questions that are legitimate management needs or priority questions that you can get funding for that allow you to go do the fun part, and having the tools at hand to to analyze the data and deliver it the way it needs to be.
You have all this data that has been helpful for things like fisheries management plans, possibly for those who are on the beaches and worried that shark ranges are changing and their beach experiences are more about being scared of sharks than being excited about them. Do you see any of these data helpful in like communicating to the public about conservation needs or other types of experiences with large wildlife?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some places that have bigger shark bite issues, telemetry is like integrated, a formal part of the sort of response and monitoring shark populations. Southern California, the East Coast of Australia, places that have a lot of shark bites, more so than here. They actually use telemetry routinely to help study where the shark distributions are. If the distributions are shifting, they can actually set up alert networks where if a shark is detected close to a certain beach, that technology is out there too. It's mostly acoustic tracking stuff too, but if you follow, like the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy has a Sharktivity app that they have satellite and acoustically tagged sharks on there, so you can get near real time alerts sometimes for when those sharks are near certain beaches. OSearch has something similar where they kind of put out a public announcement if one of their sharks was really close to a beach. They can try to get the word out. So that the technology can absolutely inform public safety. But it's kind of a big cost for not much of a problem. I try to remind people of the context that the risk of shark bite, it might be near the forefront of your mind if you're at the beach, but it's still a near zero probability. And so I think getting more data to help people understand that the risk is actually minimal is also helpful. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do now is use some of our PSAT data to show that the sharks are really spending very little time, where they're kind of overlapping swimmers.
We actually have those Zoom questions that you take.
Oh, okay. All right. Cassius ledge. So yeah, so Cassius ledge in the Gulf of Maine is sort of a bank. It comes close to the surface. It's much shallower than a lot of the surrounding central Gulf of Maine waters. So yeah, it's actually with the case of the thorny skates, I think it is actually kind of a physical barrier, the deep depths. But historically, thorny skates were kind of found continuously throughout the entire Gulf of Maine. They kind of blanketed the bottom everywhere. And now they're kind of only in these pockets where there's been protections, Gulf of Maine closed area, Cassius ledge, Stellwagen bank. places like that, so they become more concentrated in some of these lower protected areas. But historically, I think there was just kind of continuous blanketing of thorny seeds everywhere. It's definitely changed a lot.
We have time for one question. Okay, we have maybe time for two. First, the stupid question.
How is it calculated?
Like how does, because you were going to calculate it, what was the, how does it compare to what was estimated?
Yeah, so when a post-release mortality rate is unknown, in the stock assessment process, they generally they use a proxy based on literature, similar species, and so it could be way off. With skates, for example, it was, before we did our study, it was assumed to be a 50-50 chance based on some literature. And so when we did our study, we found out, oh, it's only 25%, that's a lot better. So we're forced to use incomplete information without the actual empirical data. And Jan,
One
yeah,
quick.
Yeah, thank you for wanting to talk. Just curious about a data sharing policy for you guys for this data. Because we used to like, have access to the bottom chart survey and, but I was just wondering, what would be the policy for sharing that data?
share like my data personally, or
No, just, just all the co-states.
yeah, I mean, NOAA as a government agency should be, anything that's funded or run by NOAA, the data should be being made publicly available very quickly. And that's still some people dragging, kicking and screaming towards that. But we're trying, things like the Animal Telemetry Network or the ACT network, these telemetry networks, are trying to streamline that process, make it easier for people to just say, yes, like we're gonna protect your data, but make it available. So we're definitely moving that direction. Still a lot of work to be done to make things more accessible, and a lot of it's available, but weird little pockets. So I think we need some more aggregation at central kind of access points. But obviously, the more available it is, the more of an impact it can have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.